Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's session titled Managing Your Worst Digital Day, Building Resilience into Cyber-Physical Systems. My name is Katie Brooks, and I serve as Acting Senior Director of Cybersecurity Programs here at Aspen Digital. For those of you who haven't joined us before, Aspen Digital is a program of the Aspen Institute, and our cybersecurity programming covers a wide range of topics, including recent publications and events on generative AI futures in cybersecurity, cyber regulatory harmonization, cybersecurity workforce retention, and consumer attitudes on cybersecurity as a part of the Cyber Civil Defense Initiative. You can find these reports and events and many more at aspendigital.org. If you'd like to follow us on social media or join the conversation online about today's session, we invite you to tag us at Aspen Digital on X or on LinkedIn. And finally, if you're looking to engage further with these cybersecurity topics and many others, we invite you to join us at the Aspen Cyber Summit coming up on September 18th in Washington, D.C. at the Reach at the John F. Kennedy Performing Arts Center. You can find out more about that event at aspencybersummit.org. So a bit about today's program. This event was inspired by findings on the cyber-physical crossover and the associated risks and resilience measures found by the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, or PCAST. This is a federal advisory committee appointed by the president to augment the science and technology advice available to him from inside the White House and from the federal agencies. PCAST is comprised of 28 of the nation's thought leaders selected for their distinguished service and accomplishments across sectors. PCAST advises the president on matters related to science, technology, and innovation policy. Now, in February 2024, it released a report titled Strategy for Cyber Physical Resilience, Fortifying Our Critical Infrastructure for a Digital World. As the report asserts, while cyber and physical systems were once distinct, they have now become deeply interwoven. These cyber-physical systems are at the core of the critical services that underpin our lives: our water, our electricity, banking, communications, air travel, and maybe even your home heating system, refrigerator, and much more. Cyber-physical systems are increasingly vulnerable to threats from nation states, terror groups, criminals, a range of natural disasters, as well as accidents and failures. The report goes on to say, vulnerable and underserved populations may feel these consequences of disruption most acutely. In our hour together, we'll hear a fireside chat on the report itself, featuring Nicole Tisdale, our Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity Programs, and Caitlin Durkovich, Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Homeland Security Advisor for Resilience and Response at the National Security Council. From there, we'll move into a panel discussion moderated by my colleague Yamin Huq, featuring Piyush Kumar at the Department of Energy, Phil Venables of Google Cloud, and Vishal Hariprasad of Resilience. So with that, let's dive right in. I'll hand it over to Nicole Tisdale to begin our fireside chat. Nicole?
Thank you so much, Katie. Today, I'm excited to speak with Caitlin Durkovich, who serves as the Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Homeland Security Advisor for Resilience and Response at the White House National Security Council. As the DHSA, Ms. Durkovich is responsible for the advancement of national policies and programs that enhance the resilience of the United States and strengthen the U.S.'s posture to physical and cyber threats to the nation's critical infrastructure. Previously, Ms. Durkovich served as the presidential appointed Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure and Protection with the Department of Homeland Security under the Obama administration from 2012 to 2017. Prior to joining the NSC, Ms. Durkovich served as the director at Toffler Associates and served as the non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She has also co-authored a number of pieces, including the development of the Snowcraft Center for Strategy and Security report on the future of DHS in August of 2020, and she has authored multiple documents, including the Critical Infrastructure chapter in Beyond 9/11, Homeland Security for the 21st Century. In today's fireside chat, we'll be discussing the recent released National Security Memorandum 22 on critical infrastructure security and resilience, and as Katie mentioned earlier, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the PCAST report on cyber and physical resilience. I've also had the honor of working with Caitlin at the National Security Council at the beginning of the Biden administration. And I can say, Caitlin, not only in your role at the White House National Security Council, your title is a mouthful, but you also have your hands full at
Yeah.
the White House, being responsible for both physical and cyber resilience for the nation and globally. So that's everything from our electric grids all the way to our water supply and anything in between. Can you share a little bit of your perspective on why it's important to address both the physical and cyber aspects together when we talk about protecting our critical infrastructure?
First of all, good morning to everybody. And Nicole, it is really wonderful to be joining you for this fireside chat this morning. I so enjoyed working with you in those early days of the NSC. And you will remember that we worked on some issues that really highlight the importance of us thinking about resilience from a cyber and a physical perspective. I also want to thank Katie for hosting us here today and all of the great work that Aspen Digital does on this front. I think Katie read a snapshot from the report, which spoke to how the cyber and physical systems of our infrastructure that were once distinct are becoming increasingly interwoven. And these are across all sectors of our society and the things that we rely on every day to go about our daily lives. More importantly, or equally important, I should say, is that we are driving towards an increasingly digitized and electrified society, in part to make things more efficient and more effective. And so Katie, talked about heating systems as an example. This morning, I had to get up early to come here to Boston and actually turn down the air conditioning in my house because it was a little warm. And I realized after I had left, I forgot to reset it. And all I had to do is take my phone at the airport and turn it back to its normal daytime setting. That's an example of how cyber and physical at a very personal level are becoming increasingly linked, and why we need to think about them together when we think about resilience. Nicole, in 2021, there were two major incidents that we dealt with that I think exemplify this issue, both in the energy sector. In the winter of 2021, we had the Texas power crisis. This was primarily a failure of systems due to extreme cold, leading to unexpected demand for electricity, for electric heat. And there was no resilience built into the overall system, including its cyber elements, which led to the catastrophic failure of the grid in Texas and leaving 4.5 million people without power, bursting pipes, and the such. It turns out a subsequent study was done, and it was discovered that the grid became remarkably close to a cascade of failures that would have actually damaged equipment more significantly and brought down the grid for weeks on end. A few months later, we were dealing with Colonial Pipeline. That's an incident where there was a ransomware attack on the business side of the house. The company, right, out of precaution, made a decision to take down the entirety of the pipeline so that ransomware attack didn't cascade into the operating side. It was the first time in the 60-year history of the pipeline, that it had been entirely shut down, leading to fuel disruption and fuel supply challenges, largely in the Mid-Atlantic. And we worked very closely with the company to gradually bring the system back online. But those are, I think, two great examples of how the cyber and the physical are increasingly interwoven, and why we need to think about their resilience together.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin. And thank you so much for putting that into perspective for us. I will say, I love that you're in your position at the White House. You are not only leading, but you have a team that is involved in all of the response, not just the digital response, but the physical response too. I think that leads to better operations in terms of information sharing, because the same team is working on in the example with the Colonial Pipeline, not only how do we get the digital side of the pipeline back up and running, but what do we do in terms of vulnerable populations and how they are being impacted by the gas line being down at the same time. And I think I want to transition us a little bit into getting into a couple of the technical documents for today. So I thinking about everything that happened in 2021, I know there was a lot of focus on how do we kind of advance the documents that guide us during these responses. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about NSM 22 and its objectives. So it was recently released, and it is one of the most significant cybersecurity updates to organize the federal government's efforts to protect U.S. critical infrastructure against threats and hazards for the next decade and maybe even longer. Can you give us an overview of NSM 22 and its key objectives? But more importantly, how does it differ from its predecessor, which was PPD 21, the Presidential Policy Directive 21?
Great question. And I will start with kind of my perspective on how it differs. The first thing I think that it does is that it acknowledges that threats and hazards are largely opportunistic. And you think about Colonial Pipeline, you think about, again, the Texas winter storm, the range of incidents that we have dealt with, whether it is Mother Nature or whether it is adversaries, they find vulnerable or the weakest link in our systems and use that vulnerability to cause disruption. And so one of the core elements of the new National Security Memorandum is a recognition that we need to establish minimum standards across all sectors, both for cyber, but frankly, for cyber resilience as well. We have certain sectors that either because of regulation or because of their reliability goals, electricity, have pretty strong minimum cyber and physical security standards, but we have to ensure that that baseline is consistent across all 16 sectors, and in particular, the entities within those sectors that are systemically important. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is that it really sets the stage for the next decade. And this is something that I have brought from my previous work, is the foresight in the futures casting, right? And looking out on the horizon in terms of what we can anticipate and expect. The world is very different than it was in 2013 when PPD 21 was promulgated. We are dealing with, again, a climate crisis that is causing more frequent and more intense storms. We've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and anticipation of retaliation for our support of Ukraine, for sanctions, and that we might have cyber attacks here. And of course, we know that China may invade Taiwan in 2027. And have similarly made footholds into our critical infrastructure and could use those footholds to what I call escalate to de-escalate, to cause societal discord, to disrupt our ability to project force. And so the way that we have developed the implementation plan in terms of calling for sector risk management agencies to work with the sectors to identify their vulnerabilities and then to develop sector risk management plans, all which will be rolled up into a national risk management plan that is driven by guidance given by the secretary, I think is another substantial shift. And again, the acknowledgement that we need not to look at yesterday's risks, but we need to be thinking out on the horizon. It also establishes DHS in CISA in this role as the national coordinator. In 2013. CISA did not exist, and thanks to Congress, that agency has been authorized. So it acknowledges CISA's role as acting on behalf of the secretary, leading the effort to coordinate the security and resilience of our infrastructure, but also acknowledging that the sector risk management agencies are the day-to-day liaisons with their sectors. They have the expertise. They understand those sectors, the unique way they operate, the owner the ownership structure, the regulations, and that they are in the best position to work with the actual people who are on the front lines of the risk, the owners and operators, to identify those vulnerabilities and to come up with risk mitigation plans. I think the other thing that is worth noting is that there is much more direction from the president to the intelligence community to collect, produce, and share intelligence and information with the owners and operators of critical infrastructure. Again, they are on the front lines. They are the ones who are managing the risk. So we have to make sure that they understand the threat environment, but equally important, that relationship needs to be bi-directional. And if the intelligence community is going to do a good job in providing intelligence, it has to understand from the private sector where it sees its vulnerabilities and what it's seeing on a day-to-day basis. So I think those are the kind of main core elements, in addition to a very aggressive implementation plan, acknowledging again that what is out there in what the president calls the decisive decade, but the next 5 to 10 years is significant, and we as a community have to work together to drive the security and resilience of our infrastructure, both to physical and cyber threats.
Yeah, I like that you have such a focus, Caitlin, on prepare. I think a lot of the times when we have, there's not ever really a downtime between cyber attacks, but I think making the time to look forward and say, what can we do to prepare so that we are not always in response mode, and also we can kind of mediate some of the damage that is done after critical infrastructure attacks. And so I also want to applaud the administration for really getting the NSM out. I think, as you alluded, there have been a lot of changes since the original PPD was issued. And I know your role also includes, you're responsible for democracy too at the White House, but making sure that our policies reflect our practice, especially in a community, especially with the cybersecurity community that has so many sector risk management agencies and so many cybersecurity agencies as well. So I want, because you mentioned this a little bit too, about the sector specific approach. And I want to talk to you a little bit about implementation, because both the NSM 22 and the PCAS report outline a sector specific approach with various government agencies on how they'll partner with each other to boost cybersecurity physical resilience. The term information sharing is used a lot throughout both documents. And I really want to understand what that's going to look like in practice, particularly the role for DHS and CISA, and what will it mean for the lead agencies responsible for each sector?
That's a great question. And intelligence and information sharing has been really the cornerstone of our critical infrastructure policy since the first critical infrastructure policy was promulgated in 1998 under the Clinton administration, PDD 63. I think over the last 25 years, you've had a proliferation of, as you said, entities and mechanisms for sharing information with the private sector. And frankly, it's often kind of a fire hose of information. A lot of it is generic. It's not very specific. It's not very actionable. Or because we're trying to protect sources and methods, it's nothing that people haven't read in the Washington Post or the New York Times or other mediums. And so the goal of the NSM and the fact that SRMAs are integral to this is that, again, and you're going to hear from Piyush later, who is with the Department of Energy and represents the SRMA for the energy sector, but that, the SRMAs, again, have a unique understanding into the operating environment of their sectors, of the challenges that owners and operators face, and can, I think, best represent those vulnerabilities and those challenges to both the intelligence community when we're driving key intelligence requirements, but in terms of helping understand at the end of the day, actually what is going to be valuable to the owner and operator. I say all of that, but also emphasize that we are driving towards more an early interaction with the private sector themselves, again, because at the end of the day, they are the ones that are on the front line. But every SRMA should have an intelligence element to them, or a liaison that is working to enhance and improve those requirements in the way that we're disseminating information. And again, what is also really important is making sure that this is not one directional, but bi-directional, and that we're getting feedback and vulnerability information directly from the owners and operators, because that makes our ability to collect and analyze even richer. And while we're really focused on sector vulnerabilities, I think the other thing that is different about this particular NSM is an emphasis on the cross-sector dependencies, right? Each sector is responsible for creating their sector risk management plans. But again, at the end of the day, DHS and CISA have the responsibility to roll all of this up into an overall national risk management plan, which highlights how sectors together are going to work to address their interdependencies, not just the interdependencies of cyber and physical systems, but the interdependencies of these sectors. So as a nation, we are more secure and more resilient.
Thank you. I agree. I think it's going to be kind of a whole of, I know people use whole of society a lot, but I think when we talk about the responsibilities across sectors, it's going to be key that we are in partnership with the public sector and the private sector, but along with our government officials. So I want to be cognizant of the time and kind of ask you about the call to action for people that are listening to our webinar today, because our audience is filled with cybersecurity experts and leaders, all who come from various sectors and have different roles to play in terms of our resilience. And so what is a call to action for key stakeholders to take? What concrete actions can they implement starting today?
That is a great question. I will start with, you've heard me say this. One of my favorite lines is that if you don't have healthy paranoia, you need to develop healthy paranoia. And it's not a matter of if, but when. We can't protect against everything, and you need to be thinking and constantly evaluating where your systems are vulnerable, right? And validating that you are doing what you think that you are doing in terms of following all of the various cyber security protocols, for examples, and strategies. Because as I said earlier, whether it be nation state actors or whether it be Mother Nature, they are opportunistic and they look for the vulnerable, or for the weakest link. If you are a owner and operator, and you are not part of or involved in the partnership, I encourage you to reach out to your sector risk management agency and learn about how you can become more engaged in this effort to enhance the security and resilience of your sector and our overall infrastructure. Learn what tools the government provides, a wealth of free tools in addition to the information and intelligence that we share that are available to you to help you make you more secure and resilient. And take your role as owner and operator seriously. Again, you are responsible for the economy, for the ability for us to do what we need to do on the national security front, for running or the engine of people's everyday lives. And, you know, as we have seen, all it takes is a disruption in one sector. Look at what happened in Baltimore with the large ship that, you know, it lost power, it crashed into a bridge, the bridge fell, it has impacted that community. Although I will say we have worked together to, you know, clear the water, get the port back open, rerouted transportation. But everybody plays a role in the security and resilience of our critical infrastructure. And folks need to take that to heart and to do their part.
Yeah, well, I feel so much better every time that there is an incident, knowing no matter how big it is, the people on your team, Caitlin, but also within government and the private sector are working to address this. So I want to thank you so much for making time and joining us today and helping us to all understand the importance of not only our continued resilience, but our empowered resilience. I also remember you have a sign in your office that says we can do hard things. And we recognize that this is a very difficult undertaking, but we can do it as long as we are focused and continue to prioritize cybersecurity in both physical and digital domains. With that, I'll turn it back over to Yamin for our panel discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. So yeah, let's get started on what I would imagine will be a very interesting panel. My name is Yamin Huck. I'm the Director of US Cybersecurity here at Aspen Digital. And just in the way of introductions, I want to introduce the people who will be speaking today. On the panel, we have Piyush Kumar, who leads the US Department of Energy's Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. The office is focused on strengthening the security and resilience of the US energy sector from cyber, physical, and climate-based risks and disruptions. In addition, we have Phil Venables, the Chief Information Security Officer of Google Cloud, where he leads the risk, security, compliance, and privacy teams. Outside of that, Phil is also a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And last but certainly not least, we have Vishal Hariprasad, the co-founder and CEO of Resilience, a Silicon Valley-based enterprise cyber risk startup dedicated to creating a new generation of cyber resilient businesses. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, great to be here.
Awesome. So Phil, we'll start with you. I just want to get, for at a very high 90-second level, what do you think is the key takeaway that our audience should take from this report, A Strategy for Cyber Physical Resilience? And key takeaway, I'm thinking audience, who is the core consumer, the bottom line, and what is the biggest recommendations they should take away from it?
Yeah, sure. So, and Caitlin and Nicole covered a bit of this in the discussion, but the essence of the report is really captured in the title, Cyber Physical Resilience. And again, as Caitlin mentioned, we contend in the report that we can no longer think of cyber and physical as being separate because our digital and physical worlds have just now become forever intertwined. And while this interconnection of the physical and the digital has given us great capabilities in society, it also gives us great risk. When you think about so-called operational technology, which controls our physical infrastructure, whether it's water supply or power grids or medical devices, a lot of this technology was not designed with security in mind because it was never expected to be intimately connected to everything as it is now. And so we see more risk there as well as the capability. And then the resiliency word is key because one of all of these risks and other issues, we have to think about how clearly we need to keep making sure we're trying securing and defending as many things as we can. But most importantly, we should never assume security will be 100%. And so some attacks, some natural disasters, other outages will occur. And then we have to look at not just how resilient our critical services are in the face of this to recover from events, but also to be able to operate perhaps in some minimally viable degraded state, even in the face of those events actually happening. And the report lays out a framework and a set of actions to deliver this. But I think the main audience, executives and other senior decision makers in the public and private sectors, as Caitlin mentioned, our critical infrastructure is mostly in private hands under private owners and operators, and so there's a lot of goals there, and I think there's many takeaways in the report. But if you pulled the thread on that and what the kind of the bumper sticker would be, it would be just for our leaders, both in the public and private sectors, to be much more ambitious about building in higher levels of resilience to operate in the face of attacks.
Awesome, thank you. We've talked a lot about the word resilience, right, which I think has both a technical definition and a lay definition. Vishal, can you, from your perspective, define cyber resilience for the audience, just how they should think about it, how it should differ from traditional just like defense or anything like that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and for us, we think about resilience as a business concept, risk management appropriately, right? Stepping away from cyber operations and cybersecurity, it's the ability for a company to withstand a digital hit, whether that's a mistake, whether that's externally caused, whether that's infrastructure dependent, but the ability to withstand that hit, get back up and running in as short a time as possible, whether that's through cyber means or through non-cyber means, um, work around issues. So being able to get back up online in a non-technical manner as needed, as fast as possible. That is the definition of resilience.
Thank you. Piyush, I'd love to hear a little bit more about, not just cyber resilience as our federal government does it, but what you see from your perspective, other countries doing in this space too, right? What does cyber resilience kind of look like around the world, and what kind of lessons can we draw from one another in this space?
Thanks, me, and thanks to you and Aspen Digital for having me here today. Cyber resilience, I'm really glad to hear that that is a term that we're talking about more and more nowadays. Really, when we think about cyber resilience, it's born out of a lot of other principles. We talk about security by design, we talk about security by operation, and then we also are now talking about how do we just make systems inherently resilient, as Phil alluded to, even if there is a cyber intrusion, how can we operate those very critical systems through compromise? And so, really thinking along those lines is really critical. And I know we in the US are thinking about it. As Caitlin Durkovich mentioned, the president issued National Security Memorandum 22, which really does focus on critical infrastructure security and resilience. And we're going to be doing a lot of work developing resilience baselines, both for cyber and non cyber. But we're seeing a lot of allies doing the same. So when I've talked to partners in the UK, they have standards that they're looking to update along the lines of cybersecurity for infrastructure in the UK. The EU is doing the same. They just updated their NIS2 requirements. And we're seeing it across the globe where countries are really looking at this sense of how do we bolster resilience in critical infrastructure that we depend on every single day of our lives to operate even under duress potentially. And what does that look like? But to do that, we also have to define what are our expectations for our resilience. And I think that's one of the pieces that we all collectively need to do more of is what are societal expectations for critical infrastructure so that we can define what are those requirements for that resilience and also ultimately how much are we willing to pay for that resilience, right? This all ties in together. So lots of work going on, not only in the US, but also with allies across the country, across the globe.
Awesome, thank you. And I love that you brought up societal expectations because it kind of brings me to my next section. What I really want to do is look under the hood of this report, right, and talk through some of the high level recommendations. And for the audience at home, I'll summarize it really quickly. There are 4 pillars of recommendations, right? Establishing performance goals, bolstering and coordinating R&D, breaking down silos and strengthening the government's cyber physical resilience capacity. And then last one, developing greater industry board, CEO, and executive accountability. So, taking that first one, right, performance goals, I think that ties very closely into the idea of like societal expectations and what we're willing to pay for resilience, right? Phil, can you tell me about the art of establishing a good performance goal? How we should think about that? What makes something a well-designed indicator or a minimum viable capability?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that needs to be expressed in the context of the expected objective of a particular critical infrastructure service, not a function of the underlying components itself. So, for example, and we give a few examples in the report, just one example could be no more than 10,000 people should ever be without clean drinking water for more than 3 days. I just plucks that out of the air. It's a reasonably good objective. It could be 5 days, 10 days, 20,000 people, 5,000 people. But when stated like this, it means leaders and teams in those organizations that are responsible for the delivery of that objective have to explore the kind of the edges of what might go wrong and what might happen that would prevent them from achieving that objective under a whole set of probably much more extreme circumstances than they currently think of. It also, when you set that kind of goal, it also gives society overall an expectation of how to prepare themselves. In this case, expect to have up to 3 days of bottled water at home because nobody's guaranteeing that you'll get that for 3 days in the event of some big event. But fundamentally, all this confronts the reality is that in a lot of organizations, both public and private sector, there's a disconnect between the executive level and their assumption of how resilient an organization is versus what is often known all too clearly on the ground at the front end of the operations of an organization. And that kind of bad news often doesn't filter up in organizations. And so when you state a minimum viable operating objective, even under that set of severe but plausible scenarios, it requires a much deeper engagement of leadership to confront those gaps, both system wide, not just for their organization, but the overall delivery of that objective. And this results in a much better connecting of the, as we say in the report, connecting tone at the top with resources in the ranks. Because I think there's a greater desire for leaders to solve these issues. And in many respects, there's just not awareness of the issues because the bad news about the resiliency state that many industries are in is not getting up to the executive level. And setting these objectives causes that work to really have executives to dig in with their teams about can they meet that objective.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Piyush, I'd love to dig a little bit about what Phil's bringing up specifically with regards to the energy sector. I know there's a lot of talk about like leading indicators, for example, being more important than lagging indicators. What does that look like in the energy space? And just to kind of build on it, NSM 22, I know highlights the need for minimum security and resilience requirements and getting away from a voluntary approach. How does that connect to the overall strategy here?
Absolutely. And I really appreciated that recommendation in the report in terms of establishing some of those cyber baselines and performance measures for different sectors. And Caitlin touched on a little bit of this when it came to the NSM that was released. What we're going to be doing is developing some of those baselines for the individual critical infrastructure sectors, but then they also have to boil up into cross-sector resilience measures because there's a lot of interdependencies, whether it's energy and comms, or different sectors kind of have to rely on each other. And so we have to establish those. And we have to look at what are some of those leading metrics and that we actually have to expect out of owners and operators, but also expect out of governments as well. And it's a shared responsibility. And so if we can develop some of those leading metrics that we should be working towards, that's going to actually make the country stronger in the face of these growing cyber threats that we keep hearing about, as Caitlin Durkovich just mentioned. We in the energy sector for a long time have had baseline requirements for large sources of generation, and we've had them for over a decade. But now we're seeing the energy sector fundamentally change. We're going to be having more clean energy, solar, wind, electric vehicles, and a lot of that is regulated at the state level. And so a lot of this new infrastructure does not have those same requirements. And so we're working with energy companies across the United States, particularly a lot of the clean energy companies as well, we have an opportunity to really design and deploy infrastructure in the United States when it comes to energy, and build in some of those expectations. And so we're leaning in and saying, what do we need? What do we expect out of the infrastructure as we start to use more and more of it in the future, and as it starts to become the predominant generation source for energy in the United States. So this is something we're tackling here and now. A couple months ago, we released cyber baselines for distribution systems and clean energy systems. And the idea is that we're going to continue to iterate on this. We've released version 1. As we start to see threats increase and really take that threat and risk-based approach, we need to evolve those and continue to update them over time. But there's a lot more work we need to do in this space.
Thank you for that. So one thing I want to segue into next is the recommendation about R&D. Phil, one thing that really stuck out at me just because of how distinct it was that the report called potentially for a national critical infrastructure observatory. Obviously, that creates a very strong visual image in people's minds. What is that and how would it work?
Yeah, I mean, so the background for this recommendation is one thing many of us knew, but was reinforced in the work that we did and in the consultations we had with hundreds of people as part of the development of this report, was the notion that our adversaries and attackers have more visibility on how our own critical infrastructure works than we do have of ourselves. In other words, the attackers have a better map of us than we have of ourselves. And so we contend, and this is something that the DHS, National Risk Management Center, and some other teams, and actually some FFRDCs are already working on, is to think about how do we pull together what we've called a National Critical Infrastructure Observatory. So this would be a system that would constantly map our critical infrastructure, looking for all of the dependencies between and within each critical infrastructure, and then layering on other data about vulnerability, about the state of technology, and then starting to mine that observatory, looking for things where there's previously unknown concentration risks or unexpected dependencies, or at time of adversity, using the observatory to understand where the priority areas of focus should be. And so this is a piece of work that's already starting to progress to give us that ability for us as a nation to understand our landscape better than the adversaries, so we can use it to stay ahead of the threat. And I think it's going to be pretty exciting as we get this, but clearly there's a lot of work to be done. And we were very clear that we should have a series of, if you like, minimum viable products that iterate over time. And also we've got to make sure that the visibility that this would bring isn't a target of abuse itself. And so there's clearly a lot of work to be done, but we think this is going to be very, very useful.
Awesome. So I want to talk about the education side of this as well. Piyush, the report talks about the need to incorporate resilient skills into our educational programs. What are some ways we should go about thinking about that?
Yeah, that's going to be critically important. We already know that we don't have enough cybersecurity experts here in the US, even across the globe. And then when you actually start to pare it down and say how many of those cyber experts know operational technologies or critical infrastructure, it's an even smaller pool. And so we do have to really tackle this. We've been looking at this through an initiative we call cyber informed engineering. And so how we design and develop and then deploy infrastructure systems should be done with cybersecurity in mind, much like we've had that same infrastructure design with safety in mind, with reliability and efficiency in mind. And so this is a big focus area for us, and we're certainly working with the owners and operators that are doing it out in the field. But we really do think we need to be shifting that a little bit to the left and working with universities to really integrate some of these philosophies of cyber-informed engineering into curriculum at the collegiate level. And of course, we need to be doing a lot of other cybersecurity efforts at a much younger level. But we've started some of that work. We're working with universities like Auburn, Boise State, University of Pittsburgh, just to name a few, where we're actually integrating the CIE principle or cyber-informed engineering into their curriculum. And so developing degrees and other certifications so that we can get those engineering students to be able to really incorporate some of that. I was an electrical engineering student back in the day, and the reality was we didn't talk about cyber much. And we have to change that. We actually have to really incorporate cybersecurity into that education so that later on it's just fundamental to how we design critical infrastructure in the United States.
Awesome. That's great. I too was an engineer, chemical engineer many moons ago. And yes, cyber did not come up once in our curriculum either. So it'd be interesting thing to incorporate. Vishal, so I'm morally obligated to talk about AI in every single discussion that I'm in. So I'd love to ask you, the report mentioned like the use of AI techniques as a basis for new kinds of resilience. How should we think about that? What kind of AI tools and techniques should we consider for promoting resilience?
Well, when we look at AI's impact on cybersecurity, it has impacts of helping accelerate speed, scale, and scope, both on the offensive and defensive side. Offensively, we're seeing adversaries use the power of GPT to really hone extremely realistic phishing attacks, as well as automate the scale and deployment of the infrastructure to deploy those attacks. Separately, for traditional malware, we're seeing AI be used to adapt known malware to better evade detection from existing cyber security products. What's great about this, though, is defensively, the same exact things are happening from a defender's perspective. You see cybersecurity companies doing a great job of getting statistical analysis in-house to drive or keep up with the changing face of malware so that their detection systems are better. And separately, you see a whole subclass of defensive tools for GPT, model detection, whether or not something has been used GPT to develop its text. Again, just to aid the defenders in identifying these issues. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? I think the real concept here is as we look to the future, AI is only going to speed up both the defensive and offensive elements of various tactics and techniques. What really matters is the speed of learning to both sides, especially as we think about a whole of society approach to staying ahead of the bad guys. We need to collectively get on that same page.
So the next thing I wanted to talk about was the whole idea of like breaking down silos, right? And to me, that's really about better communication across both, the private sector, public sector. Piyush, I'd love to hear more about like where do you think the biggest silos are, right? How do we get agencies to communicate better? And are there any kind of successful examples you look to for figuring out what that process ought to look like?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and the thing I like to remind folks is there's enough cyber, there's enough resilience work to go around, and we all need to be doing more of it, candidly. And so, what does that actually mean? I think it's really threefold. One, we have to establish clear roles and responsibilities for not only sector risk management agencies out there, the SRMAs, but also CISA as a national coordinator. So, what are our expectations for each of the sector leads to work with their owners and operators, but then also contribute to a cross-sector, whole of government, whole of sector approach? So first, it does come down to establishing some of those clear roles and responsibilities, and those have to come not only from within government, but they have to be informed by the private sector, who has to work with us. And so the second thing is once you set those clear expectations, the reality is we have to fund that work. Being at a sector risk management agency, thankfully, we actually are in a much better state when it comes to funding as some of my peer SRMAs. We need the EPA to be better funded to support water systems that are under attack every day, and not even just from nation states. They're under attack from hacktivists and ransomware criminals. So just imagine if you actually saw more of the nation states targeting them. And so we got to fund those agencies to be able to do the hard work of working with the owners and operators across the U.S. And then last but not least, once you've done that, then you need to set expectations. So what are some of the goals and metrics that we should be working toward? And this goes into some of the resilience requirements, the security requirements. Those SRMAs really should be leading that work and partnering with those sectors. Certainly, there's a role of independent regulatory agencies to play in this. But I found in over the years of working in the energy sector, you need both the carrot and the stick. And the SRMAs in many ways have to be the carrot, and the regulators are the stick. They have to work together, but they also have a very distinct role. So setting some of those clear expectations is also important.
Awesome. I would definitely want to come back to that carrots and sticks discussion, especially when we talk about accountability. One way to tie into that, though, Vishal, the report talks about strengthening the Cyber Safety Review Board. In your opinion, what does that mean in terms of like resources, authorities? What should we potentially be considering here?
Well, yeah, as a commercially rated pilot, I greatly appreciate the insights I glean from every NTSB report, the National Transportation Security Board, like that comes out after airplane incidents. I learned so much, and I know so many other pilots learn so much from these reports. It's a great mechanism to drive collective knowledge and maturation across the industry for individual incidents. However, the CSRB, and it's been great the first few that have come out, we have to get to that knowledge faster and can't wait years or even several months to get to actionable intelligence. One of the things I would hope to see is we've had great reports and they've been very valuable, but I'd love to see some level of parallel path outputs coming out so that we can take actionable insights to the civilian sector, to critical infrastructure companies, uh, primarily because, again, it's all about speed. We wait 2 years to get a report. The adversaries have already changed or adapted, right? They're adapting every few weeks, maybe sometimes days. So as these investigations continue, it'd be wonderful to get resourcing into actionable insights on a much faster cadence or frequency.
Thank you. So perfect. We can now get into discussion about, that accountability actually looks like. Phil, I wanna give you this question. What's it going to take to actually get boards and CEOs to truly care about cybersecurity and resilience? And by that extension, what does caring even look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the main thing is I think where we've historically been looking at security and resiliency incentives, perhaps in the wrong way, in the sense that we always talk about it's important to drive security and resilience because it's loss avoidance or it's the right thing to do, or because of regulatory or legislative compliance. And certainly, when you look at the more regulated sectors, they seem to be more secure and resilient, perhaps because they're regulated, or perhaps it's because those companies more naturally care about it because they're in such a critical sector that just happens to be regulated. But I think we have to, and we talk about this in the report as well, we have to shift away from thinking about just regulation and loss avoidance and brand impact as being the pure incentives, and actually start to realize, and again, this is why we talk about moving from lagging to leading indicators, is to say to businesses and other commercial organizations that if you modernize your technology, if you modernize your business processes, if you make them more secure and resilient, the techniques that you use to do that can be primarily done to deliver better business and mission agility, reduced cost, increased efficiency, better customer support. And as a side effect of doing those things, you can also deliver better security and resilience. And so I think we need to change this notion that we need to incentivize people for security, but rather making the things that businesses are naturally incentivized to do deliver security and resilience as a side effect of that. And when you actually get the right leading indicators on things like software, improvements in how you manage software and how you manage infrastructure, a whole array of things deliver security and resilience as a side effect of their core commercial or mission objective. And I think just reframing that is the right way. But fundamentally, and again, I'll use that phrase again about connecting tone at the top with resources in the ranks, we do have to expect some more accountability from our senior leaders across both public and private sector. There is probably no executive in the Fortune 500 that wouldn't say security and resilience is really important and pound the table in saying that about how important it is. But then when you look at how many Fortune 500 companies do stressed resilience testing, or how many Fortune 500 companies are in a public bug bounty program, how many Fortune 500 companies are members and fund the open source security foundation to drive improvements in the security and resilience of our open source software that underpins so many things. And I could kind of list many, many examples. So we have to connect this tone at the top with actual resources in the ranks to drive change. And I think this is why we should expect executives to actually live up to the accountability that they state they have. And a lot of the report around the leading indicators and other frameworks is about how do we measure that so that people can feel the accountability that causes the deeper and more ambitious actions we need them to take.
Thank you. So building on that, Vishal, what role do you think insurance plays in all this, right? Like there's an example here of a potential, market failure, and oftentimes insurance is a private sector means of like correcting it. So,
Yeah, I gotta say I agree with the comments from Caitlin in the previous session that everybody needs to do their part to get to a whole of society solution. And I think generally all companies intend to do well. However, time is money, right? And I think this is where insurance can play uh, is a great vehicle for connecting the knowledge and clarity of the regulators and the SRAs and all the items from what Piyush talked about, and putting a financial lens to it, right? Um, we can drive behavioral change by clarifying, incentivizing, and assisting companies navigate their cyber risk. We've seen that done in other lines of insurance, whether that's auto insurance driving to seatbelts, or anti-smoking campaign from the life insurance industry, or even steel-toed boots, which came from workman's comp insurance. We should see that same level of insights from the insurance industry because we are backstopping the vast majority of the civilian infrastructure, which critical infrastructure companies are part of. And I think as we think about underwriting standards, we talk about clear metrics that need to be handled, underlining or clear baselines that have been issued by the Department of Energy. These are all things that should be accounted for in the underwriting standards in order to price and issue policies accordingly. But I think the great part about insurance is that it speaks directly to a company's both carrot and stick, their balance sheet, right? And the ability to incentivize good or bad behavior and have them take action because of it. So I think insurance, again, at the end of the day, being that translation layer from the actions, and exactly as Phil said, not cyber for cyber's sake, but rather solving business risk outcomes, with security just being one of the great assets that come from it.
Thank you. Piyush, I want to ask you one specific question about critical infrastructure that's very decentralized, right? I'm thinking about, like, for example, water, something that's held oftentimes by, the many, many local governments that we have throughout our country or small companies. What are some of the unique challenges we face when it comes to improving resilience in that space, and how do we address it?
Yeah, and that's always been a challenge, right? Particularly with water infrastructure. The majority of water infrastructure is owned by local governments. It is not necessarily, a private sector entity that is looking to make money, and so you have to use a different set of levers and incentives to start to require some of this from a security perspective. Um, and so this is where I do think it's important for the government from a federal perspective to establish what are those requirements. We should set those expectations for water companies so that that even the local governments that may not have the resources to develop their own requirements, they can just pick something off the shelf and say, these are our expectations that we have, that at least get us to that 80 to 90% solution of that security resilience baseline. And then the extra 10% that we need to get to, that's maybe reserved for more critical companies. And there are higher expectations for some of those other companies that might just be so critical they can impact a larger portion of society, have larger impacts. And so we in some way, this is what we need to do. That's why we developed some of our baselines, because what we found was similar to water, on the electricity side, there's a lot of really small electric utilities that are owned by city governments or rural cooperative utilities that are really tiny. And so, how do we start to establish some of those just expectations for that infrastructure that should basically help them 80 to 90% of the way? It's not the perfect solution, but it at least sets out some of those expectations. And so, I think we need to start doing that and partnering with those communities. The other piece of this is they don't have the funding to implement this. And so, this is where the bipartisan infrastructure law gave us at DOE funding to specifically provide to those small municipal utilities and rural co-ops. We need to do the same for water. So if this is so important to us across the US, which, as we all know, water is critically important, then maybe we need to be actually putting in funding to actually support the hardening of some of that infrastructure out there.
Water is critically important is, I think, a great note to end on. Piyush, Phil, Vishal, thank you so much for this fascinating and important discussion and for educating our viewers.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Back to you, Katie.
All right, great. Thanks, Yamin. And thank you again to all of our speakers and to all attendees for joining us today. Caitlin, Piyush, Phil, Vishal, we really appreciate your time and insights. So we've covered a lot of ground in just an hour. To quickly recap, there are a few key themes as we approach what Caitlin called the decisive decade on the cyber-physical crossover. For one, preparedness is key. We need a better map of our risks and pain points than our attackers have, and we need to move our focus towards those horizon risks. Just as the sources of cyber-physical risks run the gamut, whether it's malicious activity or natural disaster, what have you, so too does the resilience measures required for a holistic approach. And that includes operational, educational, technical, and beyond. Finally, we need to bridge the disconnect between the operational realities and the executive expectations of resilience. This plays into setting realistic operational thresholds, performance expectations, and measures. And certainly, everyone has a role to play across agencies, sectors, international partners, and more, in making sure that we have a safer future. So with that, a quick reminder, if you're joining us here today and enjoyed the program, please be sure to register for the Aspen Cyber Summit coming up September 18th at aspencybersummit.org. And with that, it is the top of the hour. Thank you for joining us. And again, have a great day.